The grand chamber of the Galactic Council did not have windows. It had walls of living light instead, panels that shifted with the slow pulse of 1,000 tributary worlds reporting their harvests, their populations, their debts. To sit beneath that ceiling was to sit beneath the accounting of an entire galaxy, and the beings who gathered there had long ago stopped feeling the weight of it. They had grown comfortable with the arithmetic of ruling. So comfortable that when the item came up on the docket, the disposition of the Sol Concordat and its client species, they did not even slow their voices to say the word. Humanity. The word was there in the ledger, the way a stain is there on a floor, something to be dealt with. Something below the notice of the great powers, and yet, inconveniently, still present. Councillor Vareth of the Thren Ascendancy spoke first, because the Thren always spoke first. They were an old people, crystalline and slow, and they had ruled a third of the inner arm for longer than most species had possessed language. When Vareth spoke, the light of the walls dimmed slightly, as if the room itself deferred. The matter, Vareth said, is one of tidiness. The Sol worlds occupy a corridor we require for the meridian expansion. Their species contributes nothing to the tribute pools that could not be replaced by automated extraction. Their labor is, frankly, obsolete. I propose we transfer their sector, their populations, and their attendant liabilities to the Kalvox syndicate in exchange for the Kalvox forgiveness of the meridian construction shortfall. The humans become Kalvox stock. We recover our corridor. The books balance. There was a murmur around the great ring of the council, not of objection, of approval. It was, everyone agreed, a very tidy proposal. Councillor Essenth of the Kalvox raised a limb in acknowledgement. The Kalvox were traders and breakers, and they did not pretend otherwise. The syndicate accepts the terms in principle, Essenth said, and the voice came out wet and clicking, delighted. Human labor is soft, but it is numerous, and it can be conditioned. We will absorb the debt. We will absorb the population. We will find a use for them, or we will find a market. Either way, the shortfall is settled. And that more or less was the entire discussion. 2 speakers, a corridor, a debt, the fate of 11 billion human beings, 140 worlds, 4 centuries of a species clawing its way up out of a single blue planet, reduced to a line item, closed with the enthusiasm of a clerk stamping a form. The council did not even bother to summon the human representative for the vote. There was, technically, a chair for Sol in the chamber. A small one, added a century ago as a courtesy when humanity had first been admitted as a probationary tributary. It sat at the far edge of the ring, low and unremarkable, and for most sessions it sat empty, because the humans rarely bothered to send anyone. What would be the point? The great powers did not consult the small ones. The small ones came, if they came at all, to receive the news. So when the doors at the far end of the chamber opened during the closing formalities, and a single figure walked in, several councillors registered mild irritation before they registered anything else. She was young. That was the first thing they noticed, those who bothered to look, and most did not. Young by human standards and by any standards, her face unlined, her stride the easy, unhurried stride of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of rooms like this one. She wore a plain dark coat over plain dark clothes, no house colors, no delegation markings, no retinue. She carried nothing. She walked the long floor of the chamber alone, past the empty chairs of the middle tributaries, and she took the small, low seat at the edge of the ring, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Councillor Vareth's crystalline facets caught the light and threw it back in irritation. The vote is concluded, the Thren said. The human chair need not have troubled itself. The disposition of the Sol Concordat has been agreed. You will be informed of the transfer schedule through the ordinary channels. The young woman looked up. She had gray eyes, and something in them did not match the plainness of the rest of her, a stillness, a patience that was almost geological, as if she had all the time in the world and had come simply to spend a little of it here. My name is Ren Adiz, she said. Her voice was quiet and it carried without effort the way water carries. I represent the Sol Concordat. I've come to hear the terms. The terms do not concern you, Essence of the Calvox clicked, amused. You are the terms. Sit and be silent, small one, and be grateful the great powers have found a use for your kind at all. There are species we have simply erased. A ripple of laughter, dry and rustling, moved around the ring. Ren Adiz did not laugh. She did not flinch. She looked at the Calvox counselor for a long moment, and then she looked at Vareth, and then she let her gaze travel slowly around the entire ring, unhurried, taking in each of them, the crystalline Thren and the wet clicking Calvox and the drifting gas lords of the Nimbus Reach and the armored Dune and all the rest, the whole gathered weight of galactic power. And something in the way she looked at them, cataloging them, made a few of the older counselors feel, for just a moment, an unfamiliar sensation. Not quite unease, the precursor to it. I understand, she said at last. Then I'll listen, please. Continue. Explain to me exactly what you've decided to do with us. Vareth's facets flickered. There was something in the girl's calm that the Thren found distasteful. It lacked the proper texture of fear. But the council was not accustomed to being questioned by its inferiors, and it was even less accustomed to indulging them, and so Vareth almost dismissed her outright. Almost. But the Thren were old, and old creatures survive by noticing small wrong things, and there was something small and wrong here, and so instead of dismissing her, Vareth chose to be thorough, to make the crushing complete, to leave no doubt in the small creature's mind about the totality of her powerlessness. Very well, the Thren said. You wish to understand. I will help you understand. The Sol Concordat is being transferred to the Calvox Syndicate. Your worlds, your populations, your ships, your debts. As of the ratification of this session, you are no longer a probationary tributary of this council. You are Calvox property. Your governments will be dissolved. Your populations will be assessed for labor value and relocated as the syndicate sees fit. Those found without value will be, Vareth paused, selecting the word with the care of a creature who enjoys precision, liquidated, efficiently, humanely by our standards, which are the only standards that apply. Do you understand now, Representative Adiz? Do you understand what has been decided? The chamber was very quiet. The living walls pulsed their slow accounting. 11 billion lives on the ledger, and the ledger did not tremble. Ren Adiz was quiet too. She sat in her low seat at the edge of the ring, hands folded, and she seemed to be considering the words the way one considers a proposal in a negotiation, turning them over, weighing them, finding their shape. Then she said, "May I ask a question?" "You may ask," Vareth said. "It will not change the outcome." "I don't expect it to." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm curious. When the Calvox Syndicate takes possession of our worlds, how do they intend to run them?" Essence clicked, pleased to answer. "As we run all our holdings. Efficiently. The extraction networks, the tribute processors, the population management systems, all of it is standard syndicate infrastructure. Your primitive human systems will be dismantled and replaced with proper Calvox architecture. There is nothing your kind built that we cannot replace within a cycle." "I see," said Ren Adiz. "And the Meridian expansion, the corridor you're clearing us out of, that runs on council infrastructure, doesn't it? The relay network, the jump beacons, the whole logistical backbone of the inner arm." "Naturally," said Vareth with a trace of impatience. "The Meridian corridor will be integrated into the primary galactic grid. Why does this interest you?" "And the primary galactic grid," Ren said, still in that quiet, patient voice, "the one that carries every tribute manifest and every fleet order and every credit transfer across the whole of council space. The one this chamber runs on. The one that keeps the lights in these walls." She glanced up at the pulsing ceiling. "Who maintains that, counselor? Who built it?" There was a pause. It was a very small pause. Perhaps no one but Ren Adiz even noticed it. The half-beat of silence where a question that should have had an instant answer did not, quite, have one ready. The grid is maintained by the appropriate technical services, Vareth said. It is a matter of administration. It is beneath the notice of this council, and it is certainly beneath yours. Of course, Ren said. Forgive me. I only wondered. And she folded her hands again and lowered her eyes, and she looked once more like nothing at all, a young woman in a plain coat come to receive the news of her own erasure. Counselor Vareth would remember that moment later, would replay it in the long crystalline dark of the Thren's memory over and over, trying to find the point where it might have been stopped. And the Thren would always arrive at the same place, at the girl's lowered eyes, at the asterisk forgive me asterisk, at the perfect, patient, unhurried stillness of a creature who had just been told she owned nothing, and who had responded by asking, very gently, who kept the lights on. But that was later. In the chamber in the moment the council moved on, Vareth called the session to its formal close. The ratification light bloomed at the center of the great ring, and one by one the councilors touched their assent to it, the Thren and the Kalvox and the Nimbus Lords and the Dune and all the rest. And with each touch the transfer became more real, the ink drying on 11 billion lives. And Ren Adiz watched them do it. She watched the whole galaxy sign the paper that ended her people, and she did not stand, and she did not shout, and she did not weep. She simply watched, with those still gray eyes, cataloging, the way you might catalog a room before you leave it, so that later you can describe exactly what was there. When the ratification was complete, Vareth turned to her one final time. The matter is settled, representative. You may return to your worlds and prepare them for transfer. The Kalvox assessment fleets will arrive within the standard interval. I would advise cooperation. It goes easier for stock that cooperates. Ren Adiz rose from her seat. She smoothed the front of her plain dark coat, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, she smiled. A small smile, unhurried, and there was nothing frightened in it and nothing pleading. And this was the thing that would trouble Vareth most of all in the long dark afterward, because it was not the smile of the defeated. Thank you for explaining it to me so clearly, Counselor, she said. I understand the situation now. I understand it completely. She paused. I wonder if you do. And she turned, and she walked the long floor of the chamber alone, past the empty chairs, and she left the great powers to their tidy accounting, and the doors closed behind her, and no one in that room thought about her again for 11 days. 11 days was how long it took for the first thing to go wrong. It began, as these things do, with something too small to be noticed, which was precisely why no one noticed it in time. A single jump beacon in the Meridian corridor, one of 10,000 identical relays that stitched the inner arm together, reported a routine maintenance handshake, and then in the course of that handshake, quietly rotated one of its authentication keys. Nothing failed, nothing alarmed. A beacon rotating a key was the most ordinary event imaginable, something that happened 1,000,000 times a day across council space. This one simply rotated its key to a new value that the council's own systems could no longer read. The beacon did not go dark. That was the elegance of it. Going dark would have triggered alerts, dispatched repair fleets, drawn eyes. Instead, the beacon stayed lit and functional and perfectly obedient to a different master. It handshook with its neighbors as it always had. It routed traffic as it always had. It simply no longer answered to the council. And because it did not answer, and because the council had never once in 400 years thought to ask a jump beacon whom it answered to, no one knew. Then the beacon's neighbors rotated their keys too. And their neighbors, not all at once, that would have been noticed. In a slow, patient cascade, spreading outward through the relay network at a rate calibrated precisely to stay beneath the threshold of the Council's monitoring systems, the infrastructure of the galaxy began, very quietly, to change hands. On the fourth day, The Calvox assessment fleet arrived at the Sol Concordat to begin the processing of their new stock. 40 warships, escort tenders, population transport hulls the size of moons, all the machinery of a species that had done this many times before and expected no difficulty. The Sol worlds did not resist. There were no defense fleets scrambling to meet them, no desperate broadcasts, no last stands. The humans, it seemed, had accepted their fate. The Calvox fleet commander noted this in his log with satisfaction. Cooperative stock, exactly as the Thren had promised, and moved his fleet into orbit above Earth to begin the assessment. That was when the Calvox fleet discovered that it could not leave. Not because anything held it. There were no weapons trained on the fleet, no blockade, no force of arms. The 40 warships simply found when they attempted to plot their outbound jumps that the beacons of the Sol corridor did not recognize their authentication. The jump network, the same network the Calvox had used to arrive, the same network they had used 10,000 times without a thought, declined to route them. Politely, silently, the beacons stayed lit. They simply would not open a door for the Calvox to leave through. 40 of the syndicate's warships, and the fleet that had come to collect 11 billion human beings, sat in orbit above the blue planet, unable to go home. And back in the Grand Chamber on the 11th day, when the report finally reached the Council, Counselor S. Synth of the Calvox rose in fury and demanded to know what the humans had done to the jump network. And the technical services of the Council examined the problem, and examined it again, and came back with an answer that no one in that room wanted to hear. The technical services did not know how the network worked. They knew how to use it. They had always known how to use it. But the deep architecture, the authentication layers, the maintenance protocols, the 10,000 small dependencies that kept 10,000 beacons singing to each other across the dark, that had been handled, for as long as anyone could remember, by contractors, by technical services, by the small, obsolete, replaceable people who did the work no great power would lower itself to understand. By humans. To understand how the galaxy had arrived at this moment, how the great powers had come to depend so completely on the people they most despised, one had to understand a thing the Council had spent 4 centuries not thinking about. The Council did not build. It had not built anything of consequence in a very long time. This was not a failing in the eyes of the great powers. It was the whole point of being great. The Thren had ruled for so long that the notion of ruling had become entirely abstract to them, a matter of proclamations and votes and the slow crystalline politics of the inner arm. The Calvox traded and broke, but the systems on which their trading ran had been inherited, not made. The Nimbus lords drifted in their gas giant palaces and issued their edicts. The dunes soldiered. And beneath all of them, holding all of them up, ran the vast inherited machinery of galactic civilization. The jump network, the tribute grids, the atmosphere processors, the water systems, the medical distribution networks, the 10 million invisible dependencies of 100,000 worlds. And none of the great powers had the faintest idea how any of it actually worked, because for 400 years someone else had done the work. That someone was humanity, and the way it had happened was so gradual that no one, including the humans themselves at first, had seen the shape of it. When humanity had first crawled out of its home system, 4 centuries earlier, it had arrived in a galaxy that regarded it with the affectionate contempt one gives a stray. The great powers were ancient and settled. They had their tribute worlds and their client species and their vast comfortable machinery, and into this they admitted the humans on a probationary basis, as one admits a mongrel to sleep in the yard, useful perhaps for chasing off worse things, but never to be let inside. And the humans, being humans, had done the one thing the great powers never expected. They had looked at the vast, comfortable machinery of galactic civilization, the machinery its owners no longer understood, and they had learned it. Not out of ambition at first, out of necessity, the great powers did not give charity. If a human world wanted access to the jump network, it had to pay, and the humans could not pay in tribute, having none, so they paid in labor. They offered to maintain the beacons. The great powers, delighted to be rid of a tedious chore, agreed. If a human colony wanted a share of the medical distribution grid, it offered to run the distribution nodes. The great powers agreed. If the humans wanted anything at all, they earned it by doing the invisible, thankless, technical work that the great powers considered beneath them. And over the decades that work accumulated and accumulated until one day. And no one could say exactly which day, because it happened everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. There was no critical system in the galaxy that a human hand did not touch. Human contractors maintained the jump beacons. Human technicians ran the tribute processors. Human engineers held together the atmosphere plants of 1,000 worlds too poor or too proud to do it themselves. Human hands wrote the maintenance protocols, held the authentication keys, understood the deep architecture, kept the whole singing machine of galactic civilization from flying apart. And the great powers, who saw the humans doing this work, drew from it exactly the wrong conclusion. They saw a species that did menial labor, and they concluded that the species was menial. They saw hands in the machinery, and they never once wondered whose hands, or what those hands might do if they ever chose to close. The humans wondered, quietly, for a long time. There was a woman named Ilsa Dees, 3 generations back, who was among the first to see it clearly. She was an engineer on the Meridian Relay project, back when it was new, and she was the one who noticed that the Council's technical oversight of the human contractors had a peculiar quality. It did not exist. The Council paid the humans to do the work and never checked how they did it, because checking would have required understanding, and understanding was beneath them. Ilsa Dees wrote a private paper, circulated among a handful of trusted human engineers, and its conclusion was very simple and very quiet. They have handed us the keys asterisk, she wrote, and they do not know they have hands. The paper did not call for revolt. That would have been suicide. The great powers had fleets that could unmake a human world in an afternoon. Instead, it called for something far slower and far more patient. It called for humanity to keep doing the work, keep being the invisible hands, keep being obsolete and menial and beneath notice, and while doing it, to make sure that the work could not be done by anyone else, to let the great powers grow lazier and more dependent with every passing decade, to let the human hands sink deeper into the machinery until the machinery could not run without them, and to build, underneath the ordinary maintenance, a second architecture that the great powers would never see, a set of quiet controls, authentication keys, master protocols, a way to close the human hand around the whole galaxy's throat without ever once raising a fist. They called it, among themselves, the grip, and they built it across 3 generations, patiently, 1 beacon and 1 protocol and 1 authentication layer at a time, and they never used it, and they never spoke of it outside their own most trusted circles, and they raised their children to understand that the strength of the grip lay entirely in the great powers never knowing it existed. A hand on a throat is only leverage if the throat does not feel it. The moment humanity revealed the grip, it would be used once, and then the great powers would find some terrible way to answer it, and so the grip was to be kept for one purpose only. The day the great powers decided to end humanity entirely. On that day, and only on that day, the hand would close. Rena Dees was Ilsa's great-granddaughter. She had grown up on the story the way other children grow up on scripture. She had trained as an engineer like all the Dees, and she had spent her youth in the deep architecture of the jump network, learning the grip from the inside, until she knew it the way she knew her own pulse. And when the Council's intentions toward Saul had first become clear, when the intelligence had come that the great powers meant to trade humanity to the Kalvox and process it into stock and liquidate whatever did not sell, it had been Ren, young as she was, who the human leadership had chosen to send. Not because she was the most senior, because she was the calmest. Because when they had gathered in the deep council of Saul and asked who could sit in that chamber, and be told that 11 billion human beings were to be erased, and not flinch, not reveal the grip too early, not break, it had been Ren-Adise who had said quietly, "I can do that. I can go and let them explain it to me, and I can wait until they've signed." Because the grip only worked if they signed. That was the terrible patient logic of it. Humanity could not close the hand on suspicion, on a threat, on a proposal. If the great powers were merely considering the destruction of humanity, then revealing the grip would only provoke them into finding a way around it, into building new beacons, new networks, into taking 20 years and doing the work themselves rather than submit to human leverage. No, the hand could only close when the great powers had committed, when they had ratified, when they had, with their own assent lights, signed the paper that ended humanity and thereby made themselves the aggressors, the ones who had chosen erasure, the ones who could no longer claim they had simply been negotiating. Ren had gone to the chamber not to prevent the vote. She had gone to make sure it happened. And when Counselor Vareth had leaned into the crushing, had explained with such precision exactly how humanity was to be dissolved and relocated and liquidated, had asked Asterisk, "Do you understand now, Asterisk?" Ren-Adise had understood something the Thren did not. She had understood that the vote was cast, the paper signed, the aggressors committed. She had understood that the hand could now close. And she had asked her one quiet question, Asterisk, who keeps the lights on, Asterisk, not because she needed the answer, but because she wanted just once to see whether any of them knew, and none of them had known. And that half-beat of silence in the grand chamber had told her everything. The grip was intact. The great powers had no idea whose hands were around their throat. So she had smiled, and thanked the counselor for explaining it so clearly, and walked out, and gone home to close the hand. The closing of the hand did not look like war. That was the second thing the great powers failed to understand, in the 11 days and then the weeks that followed. They kept waiting for a war, for human fleets, for weapons, for something they knew how to answer. Instead, the galaxy simply began, quietly and everywhere, to stop working for them. It began with the jump network, because the jump network was where the grip was deepest. The beacon cascade that had trapped the Kalvox fleet over Earth spread outward, not as an attack but as a withdrawal, a slow, systematic revocation of the great powers' access to their own infrastructure. Beacon by beacon, corridor by corridor, the jump network stopped answering to the Council and started answering to a set of authentication keys held on 140 human worlds. The network did not shut down. Traffic still flowed. Ships still jumped. But now they jumped only where the human keys permitted, and the human keys, very quickly, began to permit less and less. A Thren tribute fleet, en route to collect the seasonal harvest from the dune worlds, found its jump corridor simply closed. Not destroyed, closed. The beacons declining its authentication with the same silent politeness that had trapped the Kalvox. The fleet sat in the dark between stars, its crystalline commanders baffled, unable to advance and unable after a while to retreat, because the corridor behind them had closed too. They were not attacked. They were simply set aside, like a piece taken off a board, left to wait in the emptiness while the game went on without them. The Nimbus lords in their gas-giant palaces found that the atmospheric processors that made their palaces habitable, vast human-maintained systems that scrubbed and balanced the churning gas into breathable palace air, had begun, very gradually, to drift out of tolerance. Not to fail, to drift. A fraction of a degree here, a trace contaminant there, nothing that any alarm would catch, but the cumulative effect over days was that the palace air of the Nimbus reach grew slowly, unmistakably worse, and when the lords summoned their human technicians to correct it, the technicians did not come. Their contracts, it turned out, had lapsed. No one had thought to renew them because no one had thought the humans had a choice. And on world after world across Council space, the 10 million invisible dependencies began, one by one, to loosen. Not everywhere, not all at once. That was the terrible precision of it, the thing that made it impossible to fight. Humanity did not turn everything off. It turned things off selectively, surgically, in exactly the places where the great powers had committed to humanity's destruction, and it left everything else running perfectly, so that there was no single failure to point to, no war to declare, no enemy to strike. There was only the slow, dawning, inescapable realization, spreading through the great powers like cold water through cloth, that the galaxy they thought they owned was held together by hands they had never bothered to see, and that those hands had begun, very gently, to open. Aboard the trapped Kalvox flagship, in the days before the Council understood what had happened to it, Fleet Commander Draghos Essenthvar, kin to the Counselor, and every bit as certain of his own importance, stood on his command deck and stared down at the blue planet he had come to strip, and refused for a long time to believe what his own instruments were telling him. The instruments said the fleet could not jump. Draghos did not accept this. He was a Kalvox war commander. He had broken client worlds across 4 sectors. He had never in his life encountered a problem that could not be solved by the application of sufficient force. So he applied force. He ordered his fleet to fire on the nearest jump beacon, to simply destroy the impertinent machine that declined to open his road and jump out through the gap. It was, he told his officers, a simple matter. Break the thing that will not obey, and the obedience of the others follows. The beacon did not break the way he expected. Kalvox warships poured fire into it, and it took the fire and it died. And the instant it died, the 2 beacons on either side of it recognized the loss of their neighbor, and following a protocol written 30 years earlier by a human engineer named Ils Adiz, they closed. Not in retaliation. There was no intelligence deciding to punish the Kalvox. It was simpler and more terrible than that. The network was built so that a beacon lost to hostile action was treated as a breach, and a breach caused the surrounding corridor to seal itself off, automatically, to contain the damage. Draghos had not opened a gap. He had triggered a quarantine, and his fleet was now inside it. His officers told him this. He had one of them killed for telling him, and then he sat in the dark of his command deck and understood slowly that he had made it worse, that every act of force available to him made it worse because the network had been designed, decades in advance, by minds that had anticipated exactly this. A great power trapped, lashing out, trying to break its way free. Every beacon he destroyed sealed another corridor. Every show of force closed another road. The humans had built a cage whose walls grew thicker the harder you struck them, and they had built it so long ago, and so quietly, that the Kalvox had flown their entire fleet into the center of it without ever seeing the bars. "Hail the planet," Draghos said on the 6th day, when the air had begun to taste stale in the flagship's recyclers. Tell them we wish to discuss terms." The communications officer hailed the planet. The planet did not answer. It was not that the humans refused to negotiate. It was that, from the human point of view, there was nothing to negotiate. The Kalvox fleet was not a threat. It was a fact, like weather. 40 warships that had come to commit a genocide and now could not leave, and would either sit quietly until the larger matter was settled in the Grand Chamber, or would exhaust their air trying to force a door that had no handle on their side. The humans on the blue planet went about their days. They ran their cities and maintained their machines and raised their children, and above them, in the dark, 40 of the galaxy's warships slowly learned what it felt like to be the small thing that no one bothered to answer. Draghos Essenthvar, who had broken worlds, spent those days at the great viewport of his flagship, staring down at the blue planet, and something happened to him in that staring that he never spoke of afterward to anyone. He began to see the planet, not as stock, not as a corridor to be cleared or a market to be assessed. He saw the lights of its cities come on at dusk and go dark at dawn. He saw the vast, quiet competence of a world that ran and kept running, and had been quietly keeping the whole galaxy running for 400 years while creatures like him flew overhead and called it beneath their notice. And he understood, with the particular clarity of a predator who has walked into a trap set by something it never respected, that he had spent his entire life mistaking the people who did the work for the people who could be discarded, and that this single mistake, made by his entire civilization for 4 centuries, was the largest mistake in the history of the galaxy, and that he was now going to breathe stale air in the dark until it was corrected. On the day the corridor finally reopened, the day Ren Adiz walked into the grand chamber the second time, and before she said a single word, quietly granted the Kalvox fleet its life, Draghos Synthvar felt his instruments report a clear jump path home, and he did not, at first, order the jump. He stood at the viewport a moment longer, looking down at the blue planet, and he did a thing no Kalvox war commander had ever done in the history of his people. He inclined his body toward the world below, the closest thing his species had to a bow, an ancient gesture of acknowledgement offered to something larger than oneself. Then he took his fleet home, and for the rest of his life, when the young war commanders of the syndicate spoke with contempt of client species, of stock, of the small useful peoples who did the work the Kalvox would not do, Draghos Synthvar would go very still, and his voice would drop, and he would tell them about the 6 days he spent breathing stale air above a blue planet that could have killed him with a rounding error and chose, instead, to let him live. Look at the hands, he would tell them, the same words the Thren now told their young. Always look at the hands. The day our people forgot to look at the hands, we flew 40 warships into a cage a girl built before she was born, and she opened the door only because she pitied us. Do not make me explain the situation to you the way it was explained to me. Back in Sol, in the days between the 2 chamber sessions, the human leadership had gathered in deep council to decide how far the hand should close, and the debate among them had been sharper than any the great powers ever imagined the humans capable of. There were those who argued for erasure in return, who stood in the deep council of Sol and said that the great powers had voted 11 billion human deaths without a flicker of conscience, and that the only safe galaxy was one in which the great powers no longer existed. Close the hand and do not open it. Let the beacons stay dark and the atmosphere plants drift and the medical grids fail. Let the Thren courts go cold and the Nimbus palaces suffocate and the Kalvox fleets rot in the empty dark, and build a new galaxy from the ruins, one with human hands not merely maintaining the machinery but sitting at last on the seats. They had earned it. They had built everything. Why should they not rule? And it was Ren Adiz, young as she was, who had risen in that deep council and argued them down, not with fury, but with the same quiet patience she would carry into the chamber. She had reminded them of the thing her great-grandmother Ilse had written, the thing that was the true heart of the human inheritance and had nothing to do with the grip at all. The moment we take the seats asterisk, Ren had said, we become the thing that sat in them. We become the ones who look down at honest work and see something beneath us. We become the ones who sign a species away as a line item. The great powers are not evil because of who they are. They are evil because of where they sit. That seat did it to them over 400 years, and it will do it to us in less, because we will tell ourselves we earned it, and earning it is exactly the poison. If we take the crown, then 1,000 years from now some other small despised people will maintain our machinery, and we will call them expendable, and one day they will close their hands on us. That is the wheel. I don't want to turn the wheel. I want to break it. And so the human leadership had chosen the harder path. The path that took more discipline than vengeance ever could, to hold the throat of the galaxy and decline to squeeze, to prove absolute leverage and refuse the crown, to teach the great powers the truth, and then, unbelievably, keep them alive to live inside it. It was Ren who would carry that choice into the chamber, because it had been Ren's argument, and because the human leadership had understood something the great powers never would, that the strongest thing a person can do with power over another is to hold it completely and choose to be gentle. Not out of weakness, out of a strength so total it has nothing left to prove. There was a moment in that deep council of Saul that Wren would remember for the rest of her life. An old engineer, older even than the memory of Ilse's paper, a man who had spent 70 years with his hands in the atmosphere plants of the outer colonies, had risen after Wren finished speaking, and he had not argued with her, and he had not praised her. He had only said one thing, quietly into the silence of the Gath. The unraveling of the great power's certainty did not happen in the grand chamber. It happened in 10,000 small rooms across the galaxy, in the private hours when the counselors and the warlords and the tribute masters tried, each in their own way, to find the edge of the thing that had happened to them, and discovered, each in their own way, that it had no edge. On the Thren homeworld, a delegation of the finest crystalline minds of the inner arm gathered in a vaulted hall of shaped light and set themselves the task of understanding a single jump beacon. They had one, decommissioned, brought to them intact. They took it apart. They studied its architecture for 9 days, the greatest analytical intellects of a species 3 million years old, and at the end of the 9 days their report to Counselor Vareth was a single humiliating page. They could describe every component. They could not explain how the components, working together, produced a working beacon, because the beacon was not merely hardware. It was hardware plus 400 years of accumulated maintenance protocol, undocumented adjustment, inherited human craft, a living body of knowledge that existed nowhere in any archive, because it had never needed to, because the humans who held it in their heads and hands had always simply been there. The Thren could hold the dead beacon in their crystalline manipulators. They could not hold the knowledge of it because the knowledge was not a thing. It was a people. On a dune forward station, the warlords tried a different approach. If they could not understand the network, perhaps they could find humans who would teach it to them. Defectors, mercenaries, human engineers who might, for the right price, hand over the keys. And they found to their bafflement that there were none. Not that the humans refused their offers. That the offers had no purchase, because the thing the dune wanted to buy could not be sold by any individual human. The grip was not a password one trader could hand over. It was distributed across 140 worlds, held in the collective architecture of an entire civilization, requiring the coordinated ascent of systems and people that no single defector could deliver. The humans had built their leverage the way they built everything, not as a monument that one betrayal could topple, but as 10 million small correct things done by 10 million hands, so that to take it, you would have to take all of them, and you could not take all of them because the moment you tried, the hands closed. And on the drifting palace of the eldest Nimbus Lord, in the thinning air, the great gas-drifting creature who had ruled a swathe of the outer arm for 11,000 years, spent a long night composing, and discarding and composing again, a message to the human worlds. It was the hardest thing the Nimbus Lord had ever done, harder than any war or edict or conquest, because the message it was trying to write was an apology, and the Nimbus Lord's language had no grammar for apology, because the Nimbus Lords had never, in 11,000 years, needed one. They had never been wrong in a way that mattered. They had never been small. And now the eldest of them sat in its thinning palace and understood that it had been wrong in the way that mattered most, for longer than most species had existed, and that the correction of that wrongness was going to require it to learn, at 11,000 years old, a thing its people had never learned. How to say to a smaller creature, "I did not see you, and I was wrong not to see you, and I am asking you not to let me suffocate for it." The Nimbus Lord never sent the message. It could not find the words. But it kept the drafts, all of them, and in the years that followed it read them sometimes, in the restored clean air of its palace, and each time it read them it understood the situation a little more completely, and each time it understood it more completely it grew, in some slow gaseous way, a little less like a great power and a little more like a person, which was, perhaps, the truest thing Ren Adiz ever built. though she never knew she built it and never took the credit if she had. This was the shape of the great power's education, in the days between the two chamber sessions. Not a defeat they could point to, not a battle they lost, but a slow and total revelation, arriving in 10,000 private rooms at once, that the galaxy they had ruled was a house they did not own, had never owned, had only ever been permitted to live in by the quiet tenants who kept it standing, and that the tenants had at last, and for the first time in 400 years, sent up notice. By the time Vareth stood in the grand chamber and named the thing, this is a landlord changing the locks asterisk, the great powers had already, in their private rooms, begun to understand it. The second chamber session did not teach them their situation. It only made them say it out loud in front of each other, in front of the young human woman who had come to hear them say it. And that was, perhaps, why they yielded so completely when the moment came. Not because Ren Adiz forced them, but because a great power will do almost anything to avoid saying a hard truth in public. And once it has been made to say the truth in public anyway, there is very little left it can refuse. She had not broken their fleets. She had done something the great powers found far more unbearable. She had made them admit, out loud in front of everyone, exactly how small they had always been. There were smaller reckonings too, ones the great powers never reported to one another because they were too intimate to speak aloud. A Thren tribute master, reviewing 4 centuries of ledgers, found buried in the oldest entries a single line, written by some forgotten clerk of the founding generation, noting that the human contractors had asked for nothing but the right to keep doing the work. No seats, no titles, no voice in the chamber, only the work. And the tribute master had stared at that line for a long time and felt something turn over in the crystalline dark of its mind. Because a creature that asks only to be allowed to keep a civilization alive is either the most servile thing in the galaxy or the most powerful, and the tribute master understood, 400 years too late, which one the humans had been. A Dune quartermaster counted, for the first time, how many of his own war fleet systems bore the quiet signature of human maintenance, and stopped counting when he reached a number that meant his entire capacity to make war existed at the sufferance of the people he had volunteered to burn. A minor Kalvox broker, who had once bought and sold client populations for profit, sat alone in a trade hold and did the arithmetic of what those populations had actually been worth, not as stock, but as the hands that held up the very markets he traded in, and closed his ledgers and did not open them again. Everywhere, quietly, the great powers were doing sums they had never thought to do, and the sums all came out the same, and the Aether Council convened in emergency session on the 19th day, and for the first time in living memory, the grand chamber was not calm. The living walls still pulsed their slow accounting, but the accounting had gone wrong. Whole regions of the display had darkened, not gone red, not flashing alarm, simply gone dark, the tributary reports from those sectors no longer arriving because the networks that carried them no longer answered. The map of galactic power that had hung serene above this room for 4 centuries now had holes in it, spreading holes, and the counselors gathered beneath it could not stop looking up. Counselor Essent of the Kalvox spoke first this time, and there was no delight in the voice now, only a wet, clicking fury. 40 of my warships, Essent said, are trapped above the human homeworld. 40, my fleet cannot jump out. My crews are rationing air, and the humans, the stock do nothing. They do not attack. They do not board. They simply sit on their little blue planet and let my fleet starve in orbit, and when I hail them, they do not answer. What is this? What kind of war is this? It is not a war, said Counselor Vareth, and the Thren's crystalline voice was very quiet because the Thren were old and had begun, alone among the council, to understand. A war would be simpler. In a war there is an enemy who wants something and one negotiates and one fights. This is not that. This is, the Thren paused, searching the old crystalline memory for a word and finding at last a very old one. This is a landlord changing the locks. The chamber did not understand. The chamber demanded action. The Dune, who were soldiers, called for a punitive strike, muster the fleets, burn the human worlds, make an example so terrible that no client species would ever again imagine defiance. And for a moment the chamber roared its agreement, because burning things was a language the great powers understood, and it felt, after 19 days of baffling silent loss, wonderful to speak it. Vareth let them roar, and when they had finished, the Thren asked a single question, in that same quiet voice. "With what fleets?" The chamber quieted. "The Dune war fleets," Vareth continued, "muster at the forward stations along the Meridian Corridor. To reach the human worlds they must jump. To jump they require the beacon network. The beacon network no longer answers to us. So I ask again, Counselor Dune, and I ask it sincerely because I would dearly love an answer. With what fleets do you propose to burn the human worlds? Name me one fleet that can reach them. Name me one corridor that will open for us. Name me one system in this entire galaxy that still answers to this council, and not to a human key, and I will vote with you gladly to burn everything they love." Silence. The Dune commander opened his armored mouth and closed it, and did not name a fleet, because there was not one. Every path to the human worlds ran through infrastructure the humans now controlled. Every warship the Council possessed was as trapped as the Kalvox fleet over Earth, not destroyed, not defeated, simply denied the roads. The great powers had spent 4 centuries letting humanity build and maintain the very roads their armies marched on, and now the roads had been taken up, and the armies stood in the mud, magnificent and useless. "Then we do it ourselves," said the Nimbus Lord, drifting in its containment field, its voice thin because the palace air was thinning. "We take back the network. We have technical services. We have the finest minds of the inner arm. We will simply reprogram the beacons, reclaim the keys. It is only machinery." "Yes," said Vareth softly, "it is only machinery. Tell me, Lord of the Nimbus, do you know how a jump beacon works?" The Nimbus Lord did not answer. "Do any of us?" Vareth turned the crystalline gaze slowly around the ring, and this time there was no contempt in it, only a terrible dawning clarity. "In 400 years has any species in this chamber built a jump beacon, maintained one, understood the authentication architecture that we now so urgently wish to override? We paid the humans to do it. We were glad to pay them because the work was tedious and beneath us, and we told ourselves that paying others to do the work was the privilege of the great. And the humans did the work, all of it, for 400 years. And somewhere in those 400 years, without any of us noticing, the difference between doing the work and owning the thing quietly disappeared. Vareth let that settle over the chamber, and it settled like ash. "We did not lose our galaxy in 19 days, the Thren said. "We lost it slowly, over 4 centuries, one contract at a time, and we called it efficiency, and we congratulated ourselves. The humans did not conquer us. We handed it to them. We handed it to them and demanded they carry it, because it was too heavy and too dull for great powers to carry themselves, and then we forgot that the thing being carried was our own throat. They summoned Ren Adiz on the 23rd day. They did not phrase it as a summons. They could not. A summons implied the power to compel, and the Council had discovered, humiliatingly, that it could no longer compel the humans to do anything at all. So the message that went to the Sol Concordat was phrased, with great and unfamiliar care, as an invitation. The Galactic Council requested the presence of Representative Ren Adiz at the earliest convenient time to discuss matters of mutual interest. The reply came back within the hour, and it was brief, and its brevity was itself a kind of message. Representative Adiz will attend when the jump corridor to the chamber is reopened for her use. Please arrange access. And so the Council, which 23 days earlier had traded 11 billion human beings to the Kalvox, without summoning their representative for the vote, now found itself in the position of having to ask humanity's permission to open a road so that humanity's representative could come and be asked for mercy. The beacon corridor from Saul to the chamber reopened. Smoothly, instantly, the human keys granting passage the moment the request was made, as if to demonstrate that the network had never been broken, only redirected, and Ren Adiz came to the grand chamber a second time. She came exactly as she had come before, alone, a plain dark coat, no retinue, no house colors, nothing in her hands. She walked the long floor past the empty chairs of the tributaries, many of them no longer empty now, filled with counselors of the middle powers who had crowded in to see the thing that had brought the great powers low. And she took the small, low seat at the edge of the ring, the same seat, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. But the chamber was not the same, and everyone in it knew the chamber was not the same. 23 days ago, this young woman had walked in and been laughed at and told to sit and be silent, and now the whole ring watched her with the fixed attention of creatures watching a predator they had mistaken for prey. The living walls pulsed above her, holes and all. She sat in the low seat as if it were a throne, and the strange thing, the thing the counselors would speak of afterward, was that she had done nothing to make it a throne. She sat exactly as before, small and plain and still. It was only that the room had changed around her. Vareth spoke. The Thren had appointed itself, without discussion, the one to speak, because the Thren alone had understood soonest and would therefore make the fewest fatal errors of pride. "Representative Adiz," Vareth said, "thank you for coming." "You reopened the road," Ren said. "It seemed rude not to." A counselor of the Dune, unable to contain himself, surged half out of his seat. "You will restore the beacon network," he said, his armored voice shaking with the fury of the humiliated. "You will withdraw your keys, release the Kalvox fleet, and return the galaxy's infrastructure to its rightful." Counselor Dune. Ren did not raise her voice. She did not even turn her head very far, but something in the two flat words stopped him where he stood, because he heard in them, suddenly and completely, the thing the whole chamber had spent 23 days learning, that the young human woman in the plain coat could, if she chose, let the air drift out of his fleets and the corridors close in front of his armies and the lights go dark in his palaces, and there was nothing, nothing, he could do to stop her. He sat down. "I'm going to explain the situation to you," Ren said, and she said it gently, almost kindly, and it was the exact phrasing Vareth had used to her 23 days before, and every old creature in that chamber recognized it and felt it land. "The way you explained it to me, so that we understand each other completely." She rose from the low seat, the first time in either visit she had stood while speaking, and she walked a few slow steps toward the center of the ring, into the light of the ratification dais where, 23 days earlier, the great powers had signed the paper that ended her people. She stood in that light and she looked up at the pulsing, holed walls, the accounting of the galaxy, and then she looked back down at the ring of the great powers. "You said my species was obsolete," she began. "You said our labor could be replaced by automated extraction. You said there was nothing we built that the Kalvox could not replace within a cycle. And you believed it, all of you, because you saw us doing the work you would not do, and you decided that the work was small because you had decided that we were small." She paused. "I want you to understand that you were not entirely wrong. The work is small. Each piece of it is small. A jump beacon is a small thing. An atmosphere processor is a small thing. An authentication key is the smallest thing in the galaxy. It is a number. You were right that none of it is grand. You were right that great powers should not have to trouble themselves with it." She let her gaze travel the ring, slow and patient, cataloging them, exactly as she had the first time. "You were only wrong about one thing," she said. "You thought that because the pieces were small, the whole was small. You thought that because you did not understand the machinery did not matter. But civilization is not the grand things, counselors. It is not the proclamations and the tribute votes and the crystalline politics of the inner arm. Civilization is 10 million small things, done correctly, every day, by hands that no one thanks. And for 400 years, those hands were ours. Every one of them, We maintained your beacons, we ran your processors. We held your water systems together, and your medical grids, and your atmosphere plants, and the 1,000 invisible dependencies of 100,000 worlds. We built the galaxy you live in, not the grand parts, the parts that let you have grand parts. We built the floor you stand on to look down at us. The chamber was utterly silent now. Even the wet clicking of the callbox had stopped. And you decided to erase us, Ren said. Not to fight us, not to conquer us, to erase us, to process us into stock and liquidate the remainder, because you were certain, absolutely certain, that we were beneath the notice of the great powers, that we were expendable, that the galaxy would not so much as hiccup if you removed us from it. She smiled, the same small, unhurried smile from 23 days before, and this time the whole chamber understood what was behind it. You signed that certainty into law, all of you, with your own ascent lights, and I sat right there. She pointed to the low seat at the edge of the ring, and I watched you do it, and I said thank you for explaining it so clearly. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped, and the chamber leaned in to hear it, the great powers of the galaxy leaning in to hear a young human woman in a plain coat. We built your entire civilization, Ren Adiz said. Every road, every relay, every breath of air in every one of your palaces. We built all of it, and we maintained all of it, and we held it in our hands the whole time you were laughing at us. And then you told us to our faces with a vote that you were going to kill us. She let the silence stretch. So we closed our hands, that's all. We didn't attack you. We didn't fire a shot. We just stopped holding up the galaxy for the people who decided we should die. And you discovered in 19 days that you cannot hold it up yourselves. You never learned how. You were too great to learn. She turned in the light of the ratification dais, slowly, taking in the whole ring, the Thren and the Kalvox and the Nimbus Lords and the Dune, and all the middle powers crowded in to watch. The entire assembled weight of a galaxy that had, until 23 days ago, believed itself to be in charge. Now, she said, you wanted to discuss matters of mutual interest, so let's discuss them. Let me explain the situation to you completely, the way you did for me. No one in the Grand Chamber spoke. The great powers, who had never in 4 centuries been made to listen, listened. The situation is this, Ren Adiz said, and she walked slowly back and forth across the ratification dais as she spoke, unhurried, a young woman thinking aloud in a room full of ancient predators who could not touch her. The galaxy runs on a nervous system, 10,000 jump beacons, 400,000 tribute processors, the atmosphere plants, the water grids, the medical distribution networks, the relay backbone, all of it. That nervous system was built by human hands, and it is maintained by human hands, and as you have now discovered, it answers to human keys. Not because we seized it, because you gave it to us, one contract at a time, over 400 years, while congratulating yourselves on your efficiency. She stopped and faced the Kalvox. Counselor S. Synth. Your fleet over Earth, 40 warships rationing air. You want them back, I understand. Here is the situation completely. I can open the corridor and let them jump home tonight. It costs me nothing. A number in a beacon changes and your fleet goes home and no one is harmed. That is entirely within my gift. She let that hang and watched the wet clicking creature stir with a terrible, unwilling hope. Or I can leave the corridor closed, and in 9 days your crews run out of air, and 40 warships become 40 tombs orbiting a world your syndicate wanted to strip for parts. That is also entirely within my gift. Do you understand the shape of the situation now, Counselor? Do you understand it completely? I understand, Essence said, and the wet voice had gone very small. Good, Ren said, and moved on and did not gloat, and somehow the absence of gloating was worse than any gloating could have been. She faced the Nimbus Lord next. Your palace air is thinning, Lord. It will keep thinning. Not quickly, we don't do things quickly. It will thin over months, and your household will sicken slowly, and there will never be a single moment you can point to and say this is the attack, because there is no attack. There is only the slow withdrawal of a thing you never noticed you were being given. The atmosphere processors of the Nimbus reach will drift out of tolerance until your palaces are as dead as the vacuum they float in. Unless human technicians return to maintain them. And human technicians work under human contracts, and human contracts are issued by the Sol Concordat, and the Sol Concordat, as of your vote 23 days ago, was to be dissolved and its people liquidated. She tilted her head. It is difficult to issue contracts once you have been liquidated. You may see the administrative problem. The Nimbus Lord's containment field flickered. What do you want? It whispered. Name it. Name what you want and it is yours. And here Ren Adiz paused, and the whole chamber held whatever passed for its breath, because this was the moment the great powers had been dreading and craving in equal measure. The moment the human named her price, and they would learn what humanity, holding the throat of the galaxy, would demand in exchange for not squeezing. They expected conquest. They expected her to demand the Council's dissolution, the elevation of humanity to the seat of the great powers, tribute reversed, the galaxy remade with human hands on the crown. They expected, in short, exactly what any of them would have done, because the great powers understood only one use for leverage, and that was to become the thing you had leverage over. Ren Adiz said, I want you to understand that you are not in charge, and you never were. The chamber waited for more. There was at first no more. That's the demand, she said. That's the whole of it. I want the great powers of this galaxy to understand permanently and in their bones that the thing they thought they ruled was never theirs. You did not rule the galaxy. You decorated it. You sat on top of a civilization that other hands built and maintained, and you mistook sitting on top of a thing for owning it, and you grew so certain of your ownership that you voted to erase the very people who were holding you up. She looked around the ring. So no. I am not going to take your seats. I am not going to demand tribute or crowns or the dissolution of your governments. I am not going to become you. That is the one thing I will not do, because becoming you is how all of this happened. Someone decided that being great meant never having to understand the small things, and 400 years later the small things closed their hands. I will not repeat your mistake. She began to walk again, slowly, the light of the dais moving across her plain dark coat. Here is what will happen instead, Ren said. The Sol Concordat will not be dissolved. That vote is void, and it is void because the Council no longer has the power to enforce it, and power that cannot be enforced is not power, as you are all discovering. Humanity will continue to maintain the galaxy's infrastructure, because we want to, because it is ours, because we built it and we love it in a way none of you ever learned to. The beacons will run. The atmosphere plants will run. The medical grids will run. Your fleets will jump and your palaces will breathe and your tribute will flow, and you will go on sitting in your seats and issuing your proclamations, and to any observer it will look almost exactly as it did before. She stopped and faced the ring and let the last of it fall. With one difference. From this day forward, every one of you will know the truth. You will sit in your grand seats knowing that the air you breathe is a gift from hands you despised. You will issue your proclamations knowing that the roads your words travel on can be closed by a young human woman in a plain coat whenever she chooses. You will rule, if you want to call it ruling, entirely at our sufferance, and you will never ever be certain again. That is your punishment, not death, not conquest, awareness. You will spend the rest of your long crystalline lives knowing exactly how small you always were, and exactly whose hands were holding you up the whole time, and exactly how close you came to cutting them off. Counselor Vareth spoke then, quietly, and the Thren's voice held something no human had ever heard in it. Not fear, not fury, but a kind of terrible, clarifying grief. And if we refuse this arrangement, if we would rather die than rule at your sufferance. Ren looked at the old crystalline creature, and for the first time something almost gentle crossed her face. Then you die, she said simply. Not by our hand, by your own. Withdraw from the arrangement and the human contracts lapse and the beacons close and the atmosphere plants drift and the medical grids stop and your civilization, the one you never learned to hold up, falls down slowly over months and years, one small failure at a time, until there is nothing left of the great powers but cold palaces and dark relays and fleets stranded in the empty dark between stars. We will not have killed you. We will simply have stopped saving you every day the way we have been saving you invisibly for 400 years. She paused. You have never once said thank you, counselor. Do you understand that? In 4 centuries, not once, and still we kept the lights on. That is who we are. That is the species you decided was expendable. The chamber was silent for a long, long time. And then, one by one, the great powers of the galaxy did a thing that had not happened in the Grand Chamber in 400 years. A thing so foreign to them that several of them did not, at first, know how their bodies were meant to perform it. They yielded. Not with a vote. Ren had told them the vote was meaningless now, and they had begun to understand that it always had been. They yielded the way a body yields to a truth it can no longer outrun. The Kalvox yielded because S-Synth wanted the fleet back and the crews to breathe. The Nimbus Lords yielded because they wished to keep breathing themselves. The Dune yielded because a soldier, above all creatures, understands when a position cannot be held, and this position could not be held, had never been holdable, had been surrendered 400 years ago by ancestors who thought they were being served. And the Thren yielded last and yielded most completely because the Thren were old enough to feel the full shape of it, the 4 centuries of blindness, the vast and comfortable arrogance, the galaxy built by hands they had refused to see, and to understand that the young human woman in the plain coat was not offering them mercy. She was offering them something far heavier. She was offering them the truth and telling them they would have to live inside it. Vareth rose, crystalline facets dim. It will be as you say, Representative Adiz, the Thren said. The Council accepts the arrangement. The Sol Concordat stands. Humanity maintains the galaxy's infrastructure at its own discretion, and the great powers rule at your sufferance. The old voice caught very slightly on the last word, the way a thing catches on something sharp. May I ask you one final question? You may, Ren said. It won't change the outcome. But you may. The Thren almost smiled at that. Her words from 23 days ago handed back a second time, and something passed between the ancient counselor and the young woman that was not friendship, and was not hatred but was, perhaps, the beginning of an honest thing, which was more than had ever passed in that chamber before. You could have taken everything, Vareth said. The seats, the crowns, the tribute. You held the throat of the galaxy in your hand, and you chose to keep us alive and small and knowing, rather than to rule. Why? What does your species gain from this, that it would not have gained from simply becoming the new great power? Ren Adiz considered the question for a moment, standing in the light of the dais where the galaxy had once signed her death. You're asking the wrong question, Ren said at last. You're asking what we gain. That's a great power question. It assumes the point of holding a throat is to squeeze it. She shook her head slowly. We don't want your seats, counselor. I need you to understand that this isn't strategy. It's not that we're too clever to take them or too patient. It's that we don't want them. The seat you're sitting in taught you to look at a species doing honest work and see something beneath you. It taught you to sign 11 billion deaths as a line item and never lose an hour's sleep. Whatever that seat is, whatever it does to the mind that sits in it, we don't want it near us. We watched it eat you alive for 400 years, and we would rather keep our hands in the machinery. Thank you. The machinery, at least, is honest. She looked up at the great pulsing walls, the accounting of the galaxy, the holes in the map slowly filling back in as, across council space, the human keys quietly reopened the corridors, and the atmosphere plants drifted back into tolerance, and the medical grids resumed. Humanity, having made its point, already going back to the work of holding everything up, because that was what humanity did and always had, and the holding up had never really been about the great powers at all. There are 11 billion of us, Ren-Adis said quietly. And there are 140 worlds, and there are 10,000 beacons and 400,000 processors and 10 million small things that have to be done correctly every single day or the whole galaxy goes cold. We do those things. We've always done those things. You mistook it for servitude. It was never servitude, counselor. It was ownership. The deepest kind there is, the kind you earn by being the one who actually keeps the thing alive. You can't buy it and you can't vote it and you can't seize it in a chamber. You can only do the work for a long time until the work is so much a part of you that the difference between you and the thing you maintain disappears. She smiled, small and unhurried, one last time. We are the galaxy's hands. You are only ever its jewelry. And jewelry does not get to decide which hands live and which hands die. That's the situation, Counselor Varath, completely. She stepped down from the ratification dais. She smoothed the front of her plain dark coat, the same gesture from 23 days before, and she walked back toward the small low seat at the edge of the ring, and then past it, because she did not need it anymore, and she walked the long floor of the grand chamber toward the great doors, alone as she had come, and the entire assembled weight of galactic power rose from its seats as she passed. It rose without being asked. It rose because it could not do otherwise. The Thren and the Kalvox and the Nimbus Lords and the Dune and all the crowded middle powers stood as the young human woman walked out, and none of them fully understood why they were standing, only that the shape of the galaxy had changed under them, and that the change had a name now, and the name was walking toward the door. At the threshold, Ren-Adis paused. She turned one last time and looked back at the ring of great powers standing in the light of their hold and pulsing walls. The Kalvox fleet corridor is open, she said. Your crews can breathe. I opened it when I walked in. She let that land, that she had granted them their lives before the conversation even began, that the whole terrible negotiation had happened after she had already quietly chosen mercy. We'll keep the lights on, we always have, but you'll know now, every day you'll know whose hands they're in. A last small smile. Sleep well, counselors. And she walked out, and the doors closed behind her, and the great powers of the galaxy stood in a silence that would, in one form or another, last the rest of their lives. They tell the story differently now, across the 100,000 worlds. The great powers tell it as a cautionary tale, whispered in the crystalline courts of the Thren and the trade holds of the Kalvox and the thinning palaces of the Nimbus. A story about the danger of not knowing who keeps your lights on. A story that begins in arrogance and ends with a young woman in a plain coat explaining a situation completely. It is told to the young of every great power now, and its moral is always the same, and the moral is, look down, look at the hands. Know whose they are and thank them, because the day you forget is the day they close. The middle powers tell it as a liberation. The day the throat of the galaxy was held by someone who chose not to squeeze. The day it was proven that leverage did not have to become tyranny, that a species could hold absolute power and decline to become a great power with it. Some of them have begun, quietly, to learn the work themselves, to maintain their own beacons, to understand their own atmosphere plants, not to seize leverage, but because Ren-Adis taught the galaxy a thing it had forgotten, that the small work is not small, that the hands in the machinery are the ones who truly own it, and that ownership of that kind is worth more than any seat in any chamber. And humanity tells it simplest of all. Humanity does not tell it as a triumph. There are no monuments to Ren-Adis, no great feast days, no empire christened in her name, because an empire is exactly the thing she refused, and to build one in her memory would be to spit on everything she said in that chamber. Instead, the story is told to human children the way Ilse-D's paper was told 3 generations before, quietly, as an inheritance and a warning both. We built all of it, the story goes. Every road, every relay, every breath of air in every palace of the great. We built it with our hands, and we held it in our hands the whole time they were laughing at us. And when they finally told us to our faces that we were expendable, we did not become them. We closed our hands just long enough for them to understand, and then we opened them again and we went back to work, because the work was never for them. The work was ours. It was always ours. The galaxy changed in the years that followed, though it changed so quietly that no historian could name the day it happened, which was fitting, because that was how humanity did everything. The tribute pools did not vanish, but they thinned, and the tribute that still flowed more like payment now and less like plunder, because a great power that knows its heir is a gift is a great power that learns slowly to ask instead of to take. The client species that had once been stock began, one by one, to be spoken of as peoples. The dunes stopped burning worlds, not because they had grown soft, but because a soldier who has stood inside a cage he cannot break develops a lasting respect for the difference between force and power, and the dune had learned that difference above a blue planet, and they did not forget it. Even the grand chamber changed. The small, low seat at the edge of the ring, the human chair added a century earlier as a courtesy, was never moved to the center. Ren Adiz would have refused it if they had tried. But somehow, over the years, the great powers stopped sitting with their backs to it. They arranged themselves without ever deciding to, so that they could see it. So that whatever they voted, whatever they decided, they did it in view of the small plain seat where a young human woman had once sat, and let them explain to her exactly how they meant to erase her people, and had smiled, and had waited until they signed. Ren Adiz lived a long life for a human, and she never sat in the grand chamber again, and she never wanted to. She went back to the deep architecture of the jump network where she had always been happiest, and she spent her years the way the Adiz had always spent theirs. Hands in the machinery, keeping the lights on, teaching the young engineers the grip, and more importantly, teaching them why it must almost never be used, and why, when it is, the goal must never be a crown. She grew old in the work she loved, and the young engineers who trained under her said in later years that she never once spoke of the chamber as a victory. When they pressed her, when some bright young apprentice, thrilled by the story, asked her what it had felt like to hold the whole galaxy in her hand, she would only shake her head and say that she had not held the galaxy in her hand. The galaxy had always been in humanity's hands. She had merely been the one who reminded everyone of it. And then she would send the apprentice back to the beacon they were meant to be calibrating, because a beacon left uncalibrated was a far more serious thing, in Ren Adiz's view, than any counselor in any chamber. But once a year, on the anniversary of the second time she walked into that chamber, the great powers of the galaxy send a message to the Sol Concordat. It is always the same message, and it is only 2 words long, and it took them 400 years and one young woman in a plain coat to learn how to say it. Thank you. And somewhere in the deep architecture of the galaxy she built and never ruled, an old woman with still gray eyes reads it, and smiles her small, unhurried smile, and goes back to keeping the lights on, for the galaxy that once sold her people, and then learned, too late and forever, exactly whose hands had been holding it up the entire time.